Lesson 2, round whole numbers. So, when you're rounding numbers, there's only two options. You can round up or you can round down. Now, rounding down is a little misleading because what happens is the number is actually staying the same, but I'll explain that later. Let's start with rounding up. So, let's look at our level number 4,328. So, whatever the problem asks, that's where you start. So, let's say, for example, the problem says round to the nearest tens. Round to the nearest tens. So looking at our number, we go to the tens spot. I see a 2. Now you start at the spot it says round to the nearest tens. You start at the tens, but you're going to look one place to the right. This is the number that tells you whether you round up or down. So you start in the place value place it tells you to. Here it's the tens, but you're looking one spot to the right. Here it's the 1. So if we look one spot to the right, we see the number 8. Now 8 is bigger than 5. So anytime you see a 5, 6, 7, 8, or 9, you're going to round up. So this is how you round up. So you go back to the place value you started. You go back to your 10 spot, and that digit is going to go up one number. It's going to go up one number. So this 2 becomes a 3. The 2 goes up one digit and becomes a 3. Now, everything to the right after you've rounded up, everything to the right of that digit becomes a 0. So, rounding up, our answer is 4,330. Let's look at another example. Let's say the question asks you to round to the nearest hundreds this time. It says round to the nearest hundred. So again, we start wherever it tells us to. It says round to the nearest hundreds. So we're going to start in the hundreds spot. And we see here my number's a 4. Now you start in the hundreds spot, but again, you always look one number to the right. Again, this is the number that's going to tell us whether we round up or down. So when we look to the right, we see the number 6. Now, again, 6 is greater than 5, which means we're going to round up. So we go back to the original number, we go back to 4. And again, if you're rounding up, that number is going to go up one number. So that 4 becomes a 5. And just like before, once you round your number, whether it's up or down, it doesn't matter. Once you round that one, every number to the right becomes a 0. So that 6 and 2, once we change that 5, that 6 and 2 become 0. So rounding up, our number is 4,500. Now let's look at rounding down. The process is still the same. All right, so you just follow the instructions. Let's say here the question says round to the nearest tens. Same thing as before, you start wherever they tell you to. So if it says round to the nearest tens, I'm going to look at that 10 spot and I see a 6. Now again, just like before, you start where they tell you to, but you look one number to the right. This is what's going to tell me if I round down or up. So if I look one to the right, I see the number 2. Now 2 is less than 5. So if you ever see a 0, a 1, a 2, a 3, or 4, that means you're going to round down. Now again, rounding down is a little misleading because this is what happens. Just like before, you go back to the place that you started at, the tens. But this time, if you're rounding down, you don't do anything. You do not change the number. It stays the same. So the 6 stays a 6. However, just like before, once you're finished rounding, and in this case, we just kept the 6 the same, everything to the right becomes 0. With rounding up or rounding down, it doesn't matter. Everything to the right becomes 0. So rounding down, we get the number 4,960. Another example, let's say the question asks you to round to the nearest hundreds. Round to the nearest hundreds. So again, you start where the question asks you to. If it says round to the nearest hundreds, guess what? I'm going to start at the hundreds. Now, Always, 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 you look one number to the right. That's the number that tells us what we're going to do. So if I look to the right of the 9, I see the number 4. Now, 4 is less than 5, so that means we're going to be rounding down. So I go back to the original spot, I go to the hundreds, and again, rounding down means that number stays the same. You do not change it. But always, 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 after you're done rounding, so that rounding 9 stayed the same, everything to the right becomes 0. So whether you're rounding up or rounding down, once you finish rounding, everything to the right becomes 0. Let's look at an example problem. So the question reads, a parade was attended by 8,726 people. In its headline, the local newspaper rounded the attendance to the nearest 1,000 people. What number appeared in the headline? So the question's telling us round to the nearest 1,000. So where we're going to start? We're going to start in the 1,000 spot. So if I look in the 1,000 spot, I see the number 8. Now that's where you start. Where am I going to look at? Well, I'm going to look to the number to the right. And if I look to the right, I see the number 7. I see the number 7. Now, 7 is greater than 5, which means we're going to round up. So, since 7 is greater than 5, we're going to round up. So, what do? Well, you go back to where we started in the 1,000 spot. That's an 8. So, the 8 is going to go up one digit. It just goes up 1 to 9. And then everything else becomes 0. So 8,726 rounded to the nearest thousands is 9,000. Let's look at one last problem. All right. So the problem reads, when the moon is farthest from the earth in its orbit, it is 251,966 miles from earth. What is the number of miles rounded to the nearest 10,000? All right. So again, our keyword rounded to the nearest 10,000. So again, it's telling us where we're starting. So we start at the 10,000 spot. If we look at the 10,000 spot, we see the number 5. That's where we're going to start. So we start at the 5, but again, you look one number to the right. What number is that? We see the number 1. Now, 1 is less than 5, which means we're going to round down. So since 1 is less than 5, we're going to round down. So we go back to the spot we started. We go back to the 10,000 spot. That's a 5. So the 5 does not change. When you round down, the digit does not change, but everything to the right becomes 0. So 251,966 rounded to the nearest 10,000 is 250,000.